welcome to Law and Democracy, a podcast of the election law program at The Ohio State University. I am Steve Huffner, the Deputy Director of the election law program, and on today's episode, we are fortunate to not only be joined by Ned Foley and Terry Enns and Tony Goggin from the election law program here at OSU, but also by Richard Pildes, who is the Sudler Family Professor of Law at NYU Law School. And Rick, it's great to have you with us today. Thanks for spending a few minutes.
Steve, I'm very glad to be here with all of you. Thanks very much for having me.
We've invited Rick to be part of our podcast today in the run-up to the Ohio State Law Journal's annual symposium, which will be held on February 21st here in Columbus and is also accessible on Zoom. And for that symposium event, the Ohio State Law Journal has chosen a recent book published by Harvard Law professor Nick Stephanopoulos. The title of Nick's book is called Aligning Election Law, and the symposium is being titled Election Law in a Misaligned America. And it's an opportunity for all of the participants to think about Nick Stephanopoulos's basic argument about ways in which the election processes in our country have not served us as well as perhaps they might in aligning what our institutions do with what the citizens of the country would actually prefer. Over the course of that day, the symposium day on the 21st, we'll have the opportunity to hear from a number of perspectives about that argument and to think about it. And Rick Pildes is one of the people who'll be participating in that symposium. And so today we're just going to get a little bit of a taste for what that symposium might be like. And Tony, I know we did our own preview just among those of us here at OSU in our previous episode, and we're going to be over the next several days talking to some other panelists who will be at the symposium about what they might be contributing to the symposium itself. Do you want to start us out with a little more of reflection on the symposium or a question for Rick?
Yeah, yes, absolutely, Steve. Rick will be in panel 2 with the general topic of applications of alignment. His fellow panelists will be our own Ned Foley, as well as Michael King of Northwestern's Pritzker School of Law. So our first question, Rick, is what do you plan to discuss at the symposium?
Well, thanks very much, Tony, for the question. So Nick's book on the important value of alignment can be understood in terms of larger issues and how we think about election law and the system of government that we have. It can be thought about as, and I think Nick is quite self-consciously, saying that the book should be thought about this way, as an example of what I have called a more structural approach to thinking about election law issues. And what I mean by that is that's a contrast to approaches that tend to focus much more on issues about individual rights in the political process, such as the right to vote and the like. The kind of question Nick is asking is, how do our structures work as a whole? How do we think about this in a more systemic way, a less individual rights-oriented way? Rights are still important, but it broadens the lens for people to think about election law and the structure of the political process. And in that way, it reflects a perspective on the whole field that I began to advocate many decades ago now, unfortunately, with my colleague Sam Zakharoff, when we urged election law scholars and also courts and other institutions to think about these issues in more systemic or more structural ways. So I'm very much kind of in sympathy with the project of Nick's book. And it relates very directly to the issues that have preoccupied me over the last 5 or 6 years in the field, which is, I guess if I put it in terms of one question, are there ways in which the way we structure the political process that actually fuel the extremism and the hyperpolarization in our political culture? So if you think about these issues about how to design the system of elections, from the perspective of concerns with polarization, concerns with extremism, then what sorts of political reforms across a number of different areas in the election process might we think about more seriously once you think about things from this perspective and identify that concern as a dominant concern.
Rick, can I jump in with a follow-up? And that is, while I share your sense that Nick's alignment theory is aligned, if you will, with the structural approach that you and Sam laid out, as you say, years, decades ago, Nick purports, at least as I read it, to say that he wants the alignment theory to occupy some third place that is distinct from what he describes as a dichotomy between the individual rights approach on the one hand and the previous versions of the structural approach on the other hand. And if you're willing, are you willing to think about whether or not he's accurate in sort of purporting that alignment is this new thing that transcends the previous divide that's existed in the field of election law between the structuralists on the one hand and the individualists on the other?
Well, I think what Nick is able to do in the book is take advantage of a lot more empirical information that we have, data analysis that can be done these days, given larger data sets, given the computer power that's available. So given the work political scientists have been doing in the similar space here, and kind of bringing that to bear on these kinds of questions. In terms of like the larger question about is this significantly different from the way I think about these issues or have tried to think about these issues, I don't tend to think so, because I think it really focuses on what are the systemic and structural concerns that we ought to be bringing to bear to election law, and how do we think about these issues once we move outside of the kind of individual rights approach that a lot of scholars and a lot of courts are drawn to. So I don't know. I continue to think that the book is very much in the same spirit as the path that Sam and I laid out a few decades ago, and very much in the same spirit of the kind of work and perspectives that have interested me, in the field over many years, but particularly over the last 5 or 6 years.
Well, I can keep going with some follow-ups, but I want to let other people ask questions and be part of the conversation.
I found myself wanting to just invite you to say a little bit more about some of your own recent work, which you made reference to, and in particular, the comment you made about how there are elements of the existing structures that might be driving a sense of partisanship or division, and perhaps, if I'm hearing you, that's artificial. I mean, it's making that divide seem larger than it might really be. Although maybe that's unfair. Maybe it is what it is, but it could be lesser if we had different institutions. So, can you talk a little bit more?
I would say the issues that I've thought of as kind of key points of potential intervention or political reform, if you want to put it that way, that might help mitigate some of the extremism and the hyperpolarization in our political culture. Those areas are the structure of primary elections, or changing the structure of primary elections, changing the voting rules we use to determine who's won an election, the way we design election districts, the way the campaign finance system functions and might be reformed. And then fifth, the way the presidential nominations process over the last 40 or 50 years has made it more feasible for more extreme, more demagogic type figures to actually gain the nomination of a major political party and then, potentially gain the office of the White House. And we could talk about the details in each of those areas. Some of that work overlaps with work Ned has been doing, or really draws from work Ned has been doing. And as probably all of you know, Ned and I were part of this creating this task force of about 30, 35 academics to study institutional structures that might be contributing to polarization and extremism. And, we ended up putting out fairly recently this quite substantial volume on election reform to deal with polarization and extremism. And so some of my work is reflected in that. Then there are other parts of it that aren't part of that book, but come in the form of other articles. And I see all of this as very much in the same spirit as the approach of Nick's book. And in fact, we overlap in some of the recommendations for political reform that we make.
Rick, you've mentioned a couple times that in the last 5 or 6 years, you've used that phrase more than once already today. So
Yeah.
what about the current moment has changed your thinking or focused your thinking?
I mean, I've known about the increasing polarization of American politics, for a while now. I don't remember when I first started writing about that, but that goes back quite a bit. Maybe it's 2008 or something like that. So, I had been aware, as many political scientists were before this became more visible in a more public way, about the increasing hyperpolarization, as I call it, of our political parties. But I think that the political culture more generally became much more toxic and tribalistic over the last, maybe let's say 10 years or so, roughly. And that's why I eventually began to identify that as the most important concern, in my view, at least, for election reform. Are there features of our process that push aside candidates who might, in fact, be able to win elections through the majority of the voters in a general election? And if the majority of those voters are actually not as extreme as some of what we see in our politics, are there things that in our current institutions that make it very hard for those candidates to decide to run or to actually win? Are we designing the system in such a way, or have we designed or fallen into a design of the system in such a way that more factional candidates who are supported, in fact, by only a minority of the electorate are more able to be elected than they ought to be in a system that's based on majority rule? And those kind of factional candidates tend to be more extreme as well, and tend to be more from the ideological kind of poles of the party. So the focus is really on, or a lot of these reforms that I've been kind of pushing are mostly reforms designed to make the system more responsive to actual electoral majorities among voters. And by that, I mean voters in a general election, which is when we have the most representative electorate, the largest electorate, even if there's still issues about, underrepresentation of voters who, let's say, come from lower socioeconomic status or the like. That's still the most representative electorate we have, the general election electorate. And a majority of that electorate isn't always in a position to be able to actually elect the candidates it prefers because of other aspects of the way the system works. Or candidates go into office and the incentive structures are tilted towards responding to the more extreme wings of the party. So just, one quick concrete example, we have a lot of discussion, or have had a lot of discussion over many years, about campaign finance issues. And those discussions have mainly been about issues of political equality, and issues about potential corruption of office holders. But one of the things we have learned much more about as we've gotten much more data about the political system in general and about individual donors to campaigns is that individual donors actually tend to come from the poles of the ideological spectrum. They are much more ideological than voters as a whole are. And that's true of large donors. It's true of small donors. I think small donors are even more responsive to more inflammatory kinds of moments in politics, and are even more likely to help fuel the candidates from the polls of the parties. But in general, we know now with a lot of repeated findings on this and studies of this, that individual donors to campaigns are much more from the ideological polls. And so not surprising that politicians would respond to those ideological preferences of donors who they're very dependent on, who are more at the poles of the spectrum. And I just think that's a point. It's a point that Nick makes in his book. It's a point I've written about. And I think that's just a something people are not very aware of when they think about campaign finance and our privately financed system of elections, and how it can be a major contributor to things that a lot of people don't like, which is how toxic and tribalistic our politics has become. But it's not easy to trace out what some of the institutional design features are that may be contributing to that.
Just following up on that, I think everybody on the podcast today knows that I'm a big fan of Nick's book and the alignment concept as a useful tool to evaluate our existing electoral rules and to think about reform. And like Rick, I think there is a good synergy between Nick's alignment theory and the intellectual framework that we used for the book, the volume of essays that Rick just spoke about that came out of the task force that we worked on. So I think they're going in the right direction, or essentially on the same wavelength. And I was very pleased to see in Nick's book that he associates with his alignment theory a particular aspect of electoral system design that I've been focused on, which technically goes by the name Condorcet of the French mathematician who came up with it. And Nick talks about the Condorcet voting method as the one most likely to lead to alignment, at least in certain contexts. But having said that, all about sort of the basis of agreement and overlap with our approach, I think Nick's book is ambitious in a sense of not merely wanting a kind of a practical tool to help improve our electoral system, but as a theoretical construct for sort of understanding election law entirely, if you will. Now he goes back and forth a little bit about to the extent to which alignment should be the sole value or metric by which we judge elections and electoral systems, or whether it's one of several values. But it's clear it's first among all of them, even if there's others that are in the mix. And from a theoretical perspective, we can get back to the practical implications in a minute if we want. But and Rick, this led me to want to reread a piece that you wrote or co-wrote years ago on sort of the nature of social choice, how democracies work, because the alignment theory seems to have as its premise the idea, as Steve said at the outset, that there's a way to achieve congruence between preferences as the inputs of the system and results, whether the results are measured in terms of the elected candidates. So we see that election outcomes align with election inputs. Nick also talks about alignment between voter preferences and the policy choices that members of a legislature make. So there's sort of a lot of different versions of alignment, but at that most basic version of trying to match the electoral inputs that voters make when they cast their ballots with the candidates that are elected. This sort of so-called social choice literature from people like Kenneth Arrow claim that that's not a coherent enterprise. And what I thought was very important about an article that you wrote was that we shouldn't be thinking about electoral democracy in the way that these social choice theorists do. And I was wondering if reading Nick's book and thinking about his alignment concept led you to reflect at all on that earlier work that you did and what you make of how we should think about the concept of an alignment within the framework of democratic theory altogether.
So that's a great question. The short answer is, up to this moment, no, I haven't thought about that connection. So I particularly appreciate the question. And it's something I will want to think about now. I think my initial reaction is, the way Nick's book works is a little bit harder to tease out than some people might think, or some readers might think. So you might think that Nick is saying, sort of policy by policy, the policy outcomes of the legislature ought to map onto what voters purport to want if there's a, like, say, clear majority of the voters. Now, determined, let's say, by some survey instrument or whatever. But Nick recognizes all sorts of problems with thinking that's the right normative way of understanding an appropriate structure of representation and of government. And so then he has to move back to kind of more and more general levels, in which, he basically argues something like, I don't want to make these words too specific, but the system should be responsive kind of over time to the general sort of policy orientation of voters. And by the way, this is one reason I think his approach is actually very similar to the one that Sam and I talked about many, many years ago, when we talked about the importance of the system being responsive to voters, not being locked up, so it's kind of unresponsive to changes in what people want. Anyway, so I don't know, I have to think more, but at that much more general level of responsiveness, that is ultimately what Nick is arguing for as a test, how much the Arrow's theorem problem ends up mattering or not. So you're not judging the system policy by policy, but so if the general movement of policy is in the direction that voters prefer, to Nick, that's a system that satisfies his standard, and that would be responsive in the way that I wrote about, early on when I was talking about structural perspectives on election law. I'm not sure that fully answers your question. I want to think about it more between now and when the conference takes place.
One of the things that it may almost go without saying here is that, from the standpoint of, not policy by policy, but in whatever way we can assess a more globalized misalignment is occurring, inevitably that is going to contribute to public disengagement, a kind of citizen cynicism about the institutions of government. That misalignment itself is a problem because of how it contributes to that level of disinterest, even. And that's, I suppose, more of a sociological observation, really, than certainly not a legal one, and maybe not even a political science
look,
one.
I would put it even more strongly than you did, Steve, because my view is, and this comes from work I've done, comparative work on looking at democracies in Western Europe as well as in the United States. My view is, the last decade or 10 to 15 years, what you see across all of these Western democracies is tremendous dissatisfaction with how governments are performing. And you see all the turbulence in the politics that is a reflection of that. You see in the proportional representation systems of Western Europe the rise of new parties on the right, the left, harder to characterize ideologies, that are a reflection of people's dissatisfaction with government, with the traditional political parties, the traditional political elites. And I think that when democratic governments are unable to deliver on the issues that, lots of citizens care about over an extended period of time, that's an incredibly risky place for democracies to be. It doesn't just lead to a risk leading to cynicism or withdrawal, as you commented on, but in addition, it can lead to anger, frustration. That can take the form of violence ultimately. It can take the form of people wanting a strongman figure who will cut through all of this dysfunction and, make the system work. So I think that, alignment is a particularly technocratic way of putting it, but I think the inability of when democratic governments become unable to deliver on major issues that lots of citizens care about, it's a very dangerous moment or period for democracies. And I think Joe Biden recognized this. President Biden recognized this because if you remember, the very first things he said after he was elected is, I'm going to not paraphrase. People use paraphrase to mean repeat loosely. Actually, it means to repeat what the person said. But but generally speaking, President Biden said, my role is to show that democracies can function again, can deliver again. And that's partly because of this dissatisfaction over the last roughly 10 to 15 years that's pervasive across Western democracies. And it's also because of China and the rise of China and the challenge China poses to the West and a kind of a different, a one-party, non-democratic version of capitalism, basically. and can democracy show that they're capable of delivering in a way that meets those challenges? And I think that's the fundamental challenge for democracies today.
Rick, it strikes me there are two issues embedded in that. One is, can democracy deliver what the electorate wants? But the second is exactly the way you just phrased it. Can democracy show that they can deliver? Because one of the paradoxes, it strikes me, of our time is that by a lot of metrics, the United States is healthier than it's ever been. Western Europe, in so many ways, is they have economic challenges, but that's true throughout history. Overall, if you compare Europe in 2025 to Europe in 1925 or 1825, it's a far better place today. But people don't feel that. And that's something that strikes me that the extremes have really taken advantage of. How then do we develop structures that will not only be responsive to the people, but also be able to communicate responsiveness to the people?
So I disagree somewhat with the premise of your comments. I don't know that we need to get too deep into this. But yes, I mean, of course, if you compare anywhere to 100 years ago, lots of things are much better. But that's not how people live. That's not how they judge their governments. And there are real issues. I think Europe faces greater challenges than we do. But I also think that it's easy to have too complacent a view of how things are going in the United States on the economic front if you're doing pretty well, as most highly educated people are. But I think there are more challenges out there that people are facing than some people might think. And I think people are actually a pretty good judge of their own economic circumstances, and whether they feel confidence that the future is going to be better for their kids, which is one way people are assessing their economic circumstances. So, I mean, I agree with you that here's the way I would respond, I guess, to the comment. I do think that in the new communications universe we exist in, social media, internet, cable television, and the like, it's very easy to mobilize criticism and opposition and disaffection. And I do think that creates an additional challenge for governments of whatever partisan stripe, that I think no matter what they do, there's going to be a lot of criticism that gets mobilized, a lot of disaffection that gets mobilized. So I think there's an element of that. But I think the substantive challenges are actually, pretty serious. I think, as I say, more so in Europe than here. But I think there are genuine challenges.
No, I certainly agree. I would just add, sort of as a counterpoint to my question, that is, this is often defined as a period of class realignment, and not just in the United States, but really throughout much of the world, and that class realignment is turning on the knowledge economy. There's a new book out by Matt Grossman of Michigan State about basically the diploma divide,
Right.
which is so pronounced in the United States, but it's actually also found throughout the world.
Right.
In light of that, Rick, how almost inevitably people who are going to be in government are going to be on one side of that diploma divide. It is, if we define this in terms of, in very simple terms, in terms of elites and ordinary people, it's in the end going to be elites who are having to communicate to the people that the government is attempting to respond to the people's discontent. How is there a point at which there's just a credibility issue that elites are going to encounter in this atmosphere where there's so much distrust? We saw this during COVID. We've seen it in a number of different cases. Could it be that for the moment the challenge is so sweeping that the level of public distrust of elites is so profound that real structural change might take many years until we get past the most intense period of distrust, widespread distrust among the public?
Um, I don't know about that because, you know, the reason the parties of the left throughout the West, including in the US, you know, have lost the support of large segments of the working class electorate, you know, and uh, why high education voters have, you know, gravitated towards the parties of the left in so many of these countries, you know, I think does have to do with very real policy uh, changes that were made. So I think you might ask the question this way: if people in government are more likely to be from the, you know, more educated kind of strata of society, are they able to understand what the issues and concerns, values are of working class voters? I mean, I think the answer is yes. I think that, you know, you can look at various periods in history. You know, I don't know if we take FDR as an example, but, you know, FDR certainly was the hero of working class Democrats for generations. And, you know, he had actually, I would call it almost an aristocratic kind of background, not just, you know, a higher level of education. Um, so I think it's a question of responding to the needs, the interests, the concerns, the values of, you know, large shares of the electorate. And one of the things when I talk about some of these class divides that I think a lot of people have trouble getting their minds around is the working class electorate, the non-college educated electorate, is much bigger than a lot of people realize. So it's like 60% in the US roughly, and I think it's actually higher than that in most of the European democracies. So that's a big swath of the electorate that governments have to be delivering for. But I don't think they're incapable of doing that just because people come from one background or another. I think it's a question of, can they understand these concerns? Can they respond to these concerns, you know, while keeping their coalitions together and all of that? And can they make our system, which is, you know, exceptionally complex, work to deliver? Because we have, you know, bicameralism and separation of powers. We have these actors, you know, elected under different timetables from different levels of constituency, district, state, the nation. It takes much more cooperation in our system, typically across partisan divides, to make the system work than it does in a kind of Westminster system in which, you know, once one side gets elected with a majority or puts together a majority, that's it. It controls everything. So, you know, like the Labour Party right now in the UK can do what it wants if it can figure out what it wants and what it ought to want. In terms of delivering for people in the UK, but they're not constrained by bicameralism or separation of powers.
Well, I know before we conclude our time with you, Rick, and we still have a few minutes, but I want to make sure to ask you if there's something in particular that you're looking forward to about the symposium, or something you especially hope will come out of the symposium.
Well, I assume you're asking about that in an intellectual sense, and of course, the way I'm going to answer is I look forward to being in Columbus, which I haven't been to in a while. I look forward to seeing all the people. It's a great group of people that are coming together for the conference. I look forward to a chance to kind of celebrate, Nick's book. And there's always great ideas that come out of these kinds of gatherings, and I'm sure there will be here.
Well, I know we're all very much looking forward to it. Any final other questions or comments?
Yes,
Have Rick here.
go blue.
Well done. Touche.
I taught there for many years.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
You
thank
mean
you
that
again
school
for
up north.
that school up north. Thanks for being with us on this episode of our podcast, and then we will really look forward to talking more with you next week.
Okay, great.
So,
Thanks.
so
Good
we'll
seeing you.
wrap
Look,
our Yep,
Go ahead,
we'll wrap this episode now and invite our listeners to join our next episode. We'll be talking with a few more people who are coming to the symposium. And if you need more information about the symposium, all you need to do is just Google the Ohio State Law Journal 2025 Symposium and you'll find it. So until next time, thank you.